Hello and welcome to Telesur. I'm Ian Bruce and this is Interviews from Quito, the program in which we explore some of the big challenges facing this country and the region. In today's program, as all eyes in Ecuador are on the referendum this weekend, we look at the issue behind one of the 7 questions, which almost no one is talking about. I'm referring to the Yasuni ITT initiative, one of the most audacious attempts to confront climate change anywhere this century, in which Ecuador led the world. The proposal was to leave Ecuador's largest oil reserves in the ground, beneath the mega-diverse Yasuni National Park in the Amazon region, in exchange for international compensation. To talk about this, we're very pleased to have with us Carlos Larrea. He's the head of environmental studies at the Andina University here in Quito and was an expert advisor to the government for its Yasuni ITT initiative. But first, let's take a look at this short video.
A national park of nearly 1 million hectares, the Yasuni has been called the most biodiverse area on the planet. It is home to 40% of all animals calling the Amazon basin home and 1,762 identified species of trees and shrubs. It also has large crude oil reserves that the government deems as necessary to exploit, as it would generate revenues of $20 billion to finance national development and reach the goals of good living. At the inauguration of one of his Millennium Schools in the Amazon on November 6th, President Rafael Correa said that responsible exploitation will affect merely 120 hectares of the park.
With this oil, we can build this class of schools. Now, with our oil, transforming it into education, in spectacular schools, millennium schools for the territories where these riches come from. This black gold, my countrymen.
The state oil company, Petroamazonas, has been put in charge of the project and has committed to extracting in a responsible manner. The company will install a maximum of 12 oil platforms in what are known as blocks 31 and 43. Ecuadorian law demands that 12% of the revenue stay within the affected zone in an effort to benefit the surrounding communities.
What we have said as Petroamazonas is that we undertake projects in a sustainable way, using environmentally friendly technologies and respecting nature, because this is our home. We are a group of Ecuadorians that are undertaking projects for Ecuadorians.
With mixed public support, President Correa gave the go-ahead on exploitation in August of last year, following the failed appeal to the international community through the Yasuni ITT initiative for contributions totaling $3.6 billion in exchange for leaving oil in the ground. It is expected that by March 2016, the first 10,000 barrels will be extracted in the camp of Tiputini. The official calculation is that 920 million barrels will be extracted in total, the revenues of which will go towards building millennium schools and undertaking other projects furthering national development. Liz Sherfius, Telesur, Ecuador.
So that gives us an idea of what happened. Carlos, I want to begin by trying to explain. I think a lot of our viewers may have heard of the Yasuni initiative, but probably don't know really what it was about. What was really the objective? I mean, was this meant to be a contribution to reducing emissions, to combating climate change? Was it about conserving the biodiversity? What was really the idea?
Actually, the Yasuni ITT initiative had 2 main objectives. From an international perspective, it was an attempt to both, on the one hand, reduce carbon dioxide emissions. We were supposed to save to the world about 400 million tons of CO2, and at the same time our goal was to save biodiversity in the Yasuni National Park. The Yasuni National Park now is regarded as the most biodiverse hotspot in the planet, according with the scientific evidence. So that was the reason because the Yasuni initiative was so well received by the international community, because it addressed 2 of the most important problems of the humankind at the present. In the case of Ecuador, the objective was to facilitate the transition from the oil-based economy, an economy heavily dependent on oil, to a more sustainable economy and society in the future.
And how was it meant to work?
So Ecuador committed itself to keep indefinitely underground this huge oil reserve of about 1 billion barrels of oil. In exchange, the idea will be that with the support, the effective support from the United Nations, Ecuador will receive international funds to be spent only on renewable source of energies. Secondly, reducing deforestation, not only in the Yasuni National Park, but also in the whole Amazonian region. And third, sustainable social development.
Just give us an idea of that biodiversity, because it is a very, very special region, isn't it?
Yes. According with scientific research what was published later in 2010, only 1 hectare of the Yasuni National Park has actually about 618 different tree and bush species. In the whole North American continent, they have only 650. So the numbers are quite similar. That means that only 1 hectare of the Yasuni National Park has as many tree species as the whole North American continent. That's the idea about the extraordinary and unique endowment of the Yasuni National Park.
I mean, some people say this is the most biodiverse place in the Western Hemisphere, on the planet. Well,
actually, there is not yet any known hotspot with so abundance of plants, mammals, amphibians, and fish at the same time, and also birds. So it's a very specific place. As far as we know, is the most biodiverse, most rich part of the Amazonian rainforest. And the Amazonian rainforest is the largest remaining rainforest in the planet.
And it's also home to, I think, 2 uncontacted indigenous peoples.
Yes.
Was that part of the motivation?
Yeah, of course. Because the national park is huge. It has about 1 million hectares. And it's mostly untouched, pristine rainforests. So it's the home of the 2 latest indigenous isolated communities, the Tagaere and Taromenani. They are about, we estimate that they are about 400 people. They are living as a kind of a semi-nomadic community, mostly from hunting and harvesting in the Yasuni National Park. So it's a unique cultural community, indigenous communities, and according to the Ecuadorian Constitution, it must be protected.
So this idea, a radical idea of just leaving the oil in the ground, where did it come from? Did it come from the citizen revolution government? Did it come from the indigenous communities? Where?
Actually, the initiative comes basically from 2 sources. First, some ideas from ecological organizations, the civil society, and also the national indigenous organization in the country, and at the same time was supported by the Correa government in 2007, particularly from Alberto Acosta, who at that time was the Minister of Hydrocarbons, and he was the responsible for presenting the initiative to the president. The president accepted, and in March 2007, the president presented the idea to the United Nations.
How did you get involved?
Actually, I was participating mostly from the academic community and also from the civil society. We have several discussions about how can we save the Yasuni National Park, because as you mentioned at the beginning, oil extraction in Ecuador has a record of a huge environmental devastation. So we were very afraid about the destruction of this extraordinary rich biodiversity, and also the destruction of the indigenous uncontacted communities. So we were elaborating with the government different ways of saving the park. That was the origin of the idea of keeping fossil fuels underground. Now everybody is talking about it in the planet because according with the scientific evidence, in order to fulfill the Paris Agreement about climate change, about 2/3 of all the oil reserves and fossil fuel reserves in the planet must be kept underground. At the beginning, it was a kind of a crazy idea. Nevertheless, we were very surprised that when we presented the idea in Europe, particularly in Germany, we got a very important support.
What kind of support?
In 2008, the Bundestag, the German parliament, approved the idea but with unanimous support from all the 5 different political parties represented in the parliament, including the Christian Democrats, the Social Democracy, the Green Party, obviously, the Red Party, and the Liberals. It was incredible that the Ecuadorian proposal, finally Ecuador is a very small country in South America, got so important support from the German parliament.
But that was a kind of moral support, right? It was a symbolic support. It didn't really translate into money.
Yeah, actually it was the beginning, and we have an important support also from the German government, the first Merkel coalition, which was constituted by 3 parties, the Christian Democracy, the Social Democracy, and the Green Party. And this government suggested us that they were willing to present a very important economic support to the initiative. A year later, we have elections in Germany, and the Greens were not anymore part of the coalition. A new coalition, right-wing coalition, was constituted, so the German government changed its mind. But at the beginning, we have a very important, not only from the parliament, but also from the German government. And the German government also supported, through the German cooperation, the final studies, technical studies, to present the initiative to the United Nations. And the United Nations supported it, accepted it, and in 2010 the government signed an agreement with UNDP, the United Nations Development Program, to constitute the fund. So actually the international support, both from different governments, we received money from Germany a little bit, we received money from Spain, from Belgium, from different regional governments in France. So actually the support was quite important, not only from governments and cities, but also from the civil society.
But Ecuador was looking for, I think, $3.5 billion.
Yeah, the amount of money that was expected to reach must be an important fraction, according with the initiative, at least half of the revenues that were supposed to come in the case of oil extraction. It was about $3.6 billion, a lot of money. Nevertheless...
And how much was actually promised?
At the beginning, if we did in the, Germany, the first idea from the German government was to give 50 million euros every year during the next 13 years. It was an important amount of money, about 25% of what we were looking for, under 2 conditions. First, to receive an international support from a well-respected international institution, and we got it from the United Nations. And secondly, that at least one more country will be able to contribute, and we have actually the first country to contribute was Spain. So we were on track of doing that. That we have actually an unfavorable international context. First, because of the economic crisis of 2008, and secondly, the collapse of climate change negotiations in Copenhagen in 2009. The basic idea of the Yasuni initiative is still alive. It's still alive first in the international context, because several countries are doing very concrete steps now to keep some fossil fuel reserves underground, trying to fulfill this idea of keeping global warming below 2 centigrade degrees. And now, under the Paris Agreement, I think we have a very different international context.
But there's a big jump from that and saying, and please pay us for it. Isn't
Yeah.
there? I mean, you know, within the, you know,
Yeah,
you say,
yeah.
why am I going to pay you for nothing?
Was at that time a difficult task. I think the idea is still alive, and we can try to build a different mechanism, probably based on the experience of the Yasuni ITT initiative, but many people now understand that in order to keep the Paris Agreement, we need to do something else, not only to try to reduce demand of fossil fuels, for example, but carbon taxes or carbon markets, which is the main goal followed by Kyoto Protocol and also the Paris Agreement, because we have a strong empirical experience that these kind of measures are not sufficient, are not enough. We need to do something else. The only particular experience of an international agreement to try to do that was the initiative, the Yasuni initiative. So I think we presented an idea to the international community, and we hope it can be transformed in some way, but the idea is still alive. We have a lot of literature asking different ways to contribute to mitigation, keeping fossil fuels underground.
Do you think there was perhaps a conceptual confusion or maybe a difference of views on exactly how that compensation might happen?
Actually, one of the problems of the initiative was that we presented something very new, something outside the box, yeah? Because everybody was working on carbon markets, on this kind of idea, and we presented a completely new revolutionary idea. So I agree with Minister Espinosa. The initiative was not able to fit into the current negotiating mechanism of that time. That's why we need to invent something new. It was very difficult for a small country like Ecuador to do everything. But now, with much more important scientific evidence about the need to keep a very significant fraction of fossil fuel reserves underground in order to avoid the catastrophic effects of climate change, and now with the scientific evidence also about the unique biodiversity of the Yasuni National Park, I think we might have more hope that this idea will come again to the table discussion sometime in the future.
I mean, so far, you know, although the initiative was abandoned in 2013, not much, if any, oil has actually been extracted from the ITT.
That is true. We are still on time to save the Yasuni National Park. That is an important point. Secondly, most of the public opinion in Ecuador has been always in favor of keeping fossil fuels underground in the Yasuni National Park. We have several opinion polls since 2007, and we have a consistent support from the public opinion. That is why we were satisfied with the decision of the current Ecuadorian government to include a question about some control of the exploitation of the oil extraction in the Yasuni National Park as a question in the next referendum.
Explain that to me, because it seems a slightly strange question. I mean, it's not actually about keeping the oil in the ground. It's just about expanding slightly the protected area, right?
It is not the kind of question we hope to see. Actually, there was a social movement in 2013 and 14 and so on that collected 750,000 signatures asking for a national referendum with a very well-defined question. Would you be able to support the idea of keeping fossil fuels underground in the Yasuni National Park? So this is not a question we are going to have. The question says essentially that the extraction will be somehow regulated in the Yasuni National Park. So
which is what the Korea government said anyway.
Yeah, actually there is no a kind of strong question about whether or not extract oil in the Yasuni National Park. Is a question about, for example, expanding the intangible zone, which is an area in which any kind of activity will be allowed, but it doesn't say where in the national park. It is a question about regulating the number of hectares linked with oil extraction and so on. But we think that if this question is going to be accepted and approved by the majority of Ecuadorians, we will have a very important moral support from the idea of preserving the Yasuni National Park.
But if you ask the same people who are in favor of leaving the oil in the ground whether they want that money to be spent on schools and health and other social services, they'd probably say yes as well. I mean, there's a contradiction there, isn't there?
Yeah, obviously the wording of a question might have an effect on the answer. But nevertheless, what I can see from different opinion polls and surveys we have conducted, or different institutions have done, both in the Amazon region and also in Ecuador, the experience, the 50-year experience of living with oil extraction in the Amazon is so frustrating for people in the Amazon that they strongly oppose the expansion of oil, the oil frontier in the Amazon, because they are still as poor as they were several decades ago. They received a very teeny fraction of oil revenues. So that we did some research, and for example, today the Amazon region is still the poorest region in Ecuador, but they produce more than half of Ecuadorian exports. So there is a contradiction, because we have living in a model of very, very unequal development. So the result of development has been very concentrated, for example, in Quito, in the main cities, and people in the countryside, the peasantry, and particularly people in the Amazon, receiving actually very little benefits from oil extraction. But they are supporting the pollution, their health is affected. In the case of many indigenous groups, they have a very serious problem with their territories and so on.
I want to move on to, probably we don't have a lot of time, onto what is quite a big question. We probably only just begin to touch on it. I mean, there seems to be a huge dilemma facing the Ecuadorian government and other governments of the ALBA alliance, if you like. They've taken quite strong positions at the COP negotiations on climate change, on demanding climate justice, on reducing emissions, and so on and so forth. But all of them, or most of them, remain very heavily dependent on the production of fossil fuels. You know, they're basic,
yeah.
and they have, and it seems to be so difficult to break out of that. You know,
yes,
I mean,
yes.
President Correa argued that we're going to use those resources in order to break out of it. Yeah, but that move is hugely difficult.
Yeah, this is a theoretical. From the theoretical perspective, is a good reason for extracting the oil, to invest the oil in development. But nevertheless, it didn't happen properly in many oil-dependent countries. You can see the situation, for example, in the Middle East. We have very conflictive societies, and to make a transition from an oil-based economy to a more sustainable economy proved to be very difficult for many oil-dependent countries. That is why, in the case of Ecuador, which is very different from the Venezuela case, because Venezuela has one of the largest oil reserves in the world. So they have oil for a while in the future, many more decades. But in Ecuador, we are going to be an oil importer country in the 2030s. So we will have the possibility of continuing, even including the Yasuni ITT reserve, we will continue being an oil exporter country only for maybe 15 more years. So we need to begin thinking in a transition to a more sustainable economy. That is why there is a kind of imperative to diversify the economy. We need to think in more sustainable ways to satisfy the basic needs of the population. So we cannot continue.
That's why your book proposes. Yeah,
our book is about that. How can we have a sustainable and distributive development project in Ecuador in the 1920s, in the 2020s or 2030s, in the next decades?
But is it really possible? I mean, is it a pipe dream or is it realistic?
No, I think it's possible.
And just to finish, does this plebiscite, does this question lead us towards that in any way at all?
I think it will be a difficult transition, but it is necessary to do so. Because Ecuador is a very rich country. In addition to oil, we have a huge biodiversity. We are located in the middle of the world, in the Ecuadorian line, so we have a lot of water. We have the Andean Mountains. We have the Galapagos Islands. So we have a huge natural endowment and a very important cultural diversity. In Ecuador, 14 different indigenous languages are spoken. That's very important in one of the countries which is the smallest in South America. So I think the possibility of achieving a bettering of the living conditions of the population, preserving nature, it is still possible. We have the example of Costa Rica, a very small country like Ecuador, but they have been able to diversify their economy, and now tourism, ecotourism, tourism based on nature is probably the most important foreign exchange source in that country. I think Ecuador, as a small country, might follow more or less the same path. So I think, for example, now Ecuador is receiving 1.5 million tourists, international tourists every year. So we can expand this base.
But unfortunately, we could go on for a long time, and we're running out of time. But I mean, tourism as a substitute for oil?
I think so. I think, well, we can have much more employment generated. And in addition, the problem is that we are running out of oil. That means that we have no choice. Again, Venezuela can still rely on oil for maybe to half of the century more, but it is not the case of Ecuador. That's why we urgently need to design a transition for a different kind of economy. And you can see tourism is an industry that it is expanded very quickly. International tourism based on nature. So I think we can have expectations about it. It's a very dynamic industry in the future. So I think it is a possibility that obviously cannot, it will be a slow transition, but I think it is possible.
Carlos, I'm afraid we're out of time there. We're going to have to wrap it up there. We've just touched on some very big issues facing this country and the whole of the region. You can certainly find a lot more of those arguments in Carlos's book, which is, I've only got a little way through it so far, but it's certainly fascinating and very thought-provoking. Thank you so much, Carlos.
Thank you very much for the invitation again.
Thank you. We've been talking to Carlos Larrea, political economist, head of environmental studies at the Andean University here in Quito, about this very extraordinary Yasuni ITT initiative, which he thinks, and many other people in Ecuador here think, could possibly be revived. Thank you for watching Interviews from Quito. I'm Ian Bruce. Until next time.